You are the very beautiful community, and we are going to dive into the latest escapade of the Russian opposition. Ilya Yashin has, and why, Vlad, are you talking about this? Because it applies to us, because their issues are intensifications of issues we've got, right? So this is not just sort of a speculative trip to a zoo. By the way, I don't like zoos, they're prisons for animals, but some exceptions, but this is not a zoo trip for us to kind of go ahead and laugh at a few people who can't get into politics properly. What I'm going to do is I'm just put it in front of myself a screen where I am told Ilya Yashin was asked directly a question, what does your party stand for? And then whatever he says, I've got here, and I'm going to react. Okay? So this is him on Bild in Russian with Maxim Kurnikov, the presenter, asking interrogative questions of Ilya Yashin. Let's rock and roll, press record on the phone. Okay, fingers crossed, fingers crossed. What political views will the party have? It's a party evidently of the democratic center. It forms a very wide platform for the unification of people with fairly different points of view. What I want to say is that parties work in two ways. There are ideological parties, like the Social Democrats in Germany, where people of a particular point of view gather. And there are people of a more broad variety. For instance, like the Democratic Party in the United States, where there is a fairly broad diversity of opinions from the center to the left. There are different platforms and a fairly high degree of internal debate. It's that latter kind of party that we're creating. In the Congress, there were representatives of very different movements, representatives of left-wing views, social democratic views. There were representatives of conservative views. We even had a priest who came in his robes, representing a Christian Democrat, more conservative perspective. We had people with green views, with liberal views. And indeed, there were even people with green hair. Yes, and that we had that too, and that's also normal. We had a youth fraction, which will be fairly robust. We're going to have a feminist fraction that's fairly robust. So our party is creating a platform for the interaction of very different kinds of oppositional groups. And what's most important is that we are able to form, over time, this institute of collegiate decision-making and reach a high level of political discourse so that that high level of political discourse leads to effective decisions being taken. Do you want to put your finger on what's weird? Put in the comments what you think is weird about this. Now, let's give some credit first. What's good? What's good is that we applaud oppositional Russians in general. We applaud Russians who are against the war and against Putin. And we also applaud Russians who want to do something. Okay. But let's now get to politics. What do you think is wrong with what we heard? Because we often talk about procedure on the channels. We often talk about procedural adequacy. We often talk about good things coming from adequate procedures. So he's just talking about the elaboration of adequate procedure over 2 minutes. Instead of saying what the party stands for, he said the party is an umbrella of different political persuasions that is aiming to achieve a level of procedural adequacy that will then convert these persuasions into effective political position taking, whatever that might mean. So you're already smelling that something is off. But what is it exactly that is off? The number of people who actively support Putin in Russia, and by actively I mean substantively, and who substantively support the war is small. The number of people with liberal democratic views of a substantive kind is small. The majority of the Russian population are radically depoliticized, and they outsource politics to Putin, hoping that he doesn't do bad stuff and that he does good stuff. But when he does stuff, they feel they shouldn't judge whether it's good or bad because it's none of their business. So there's a kind of evasive, inferential acceptance of the regime. I mean, hopefully they know enough about what to do that they don't do terrible things, but we don't control that, and whether they do good or terrible things, we won't be able to identify that. What's keeping Russians stuck in that perspective is the absence of the perception of an actionable alternative. And the problem has been that discourse around, this is the first problem. The second problem is that discourse around an actionable alternative has been bogus. Because discourse around an actionable alternative has been discourse about two things: the corruption or incompetence of the Putin regime, or its immorality in various kinds of ways, and two, Russia's path toward being a normal Western country. What is the kind of future you want for Russia? You can ask even the most politically minded Russian opposition figure, Alexei Navalny. And the answer is going to come: we're going to want a beautiful Russia of the future that vaguely looks like a Western country. And so that was an evasive placeholder that looked like a political proposal, but in fact it was just a kind of anesthetic patching up the persistence of a radically depoliticized state. And so given that that's Russia's history, and given that that's the history of the Russian opposition, what are you going to do when you set up a purely procedural arrangement? What you're going to do is just revert to this evasive placeholder of the beautiful Russia of the future. So what we've just witnessed is not, most interestingly, what Medusa reported, which is that there were lots of procedural quarrels about how to organize all of this stuff. What we witnessed is an evasion of engagement with the possibility of an alternative future. Right? That answer was ludicrously evasive. Of what? Of politics. But no, I'm doing politics. I'm doing this procedural stuff. We've got committees, we've got subcommittees, we've got delegates, we've got congresses, we've got blah, blah, blah. It's all politics, right? Politics is about power. Politics is about change. Politics is about conflict and success in conflict. In the Russian context, that cannot be done without the proposal of an alternative. Because not only is there an absence of a set of possible alternatives that are present in the minds of oppositional, potentially oppositional Russians, but you've actually got a systematic and historically embedded evasion that needs to be unblocked of the very notion of exploring and conceptualizing an alternative via an act of political imagination. So what do you do? What you do is you start with two facts, and then you make a second move. So what are the two facts you start with? The first fact you start with is that we live in a very, 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 to use the Baumian term, liquid world. So there are all of these social forces that are undermining democracy, untethering of social bonds, the state of social media, ideologies of self-realization, extraordinary levels of economic disempowerment, inequality, blah, 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 right? Many liquid forces in our society. You recognize that that applies to everybody. And you say, this is a global thing, and actually it applies to Russia a very great deal, as well as to Ukraine, as well as to the West. The second thing you say, the global order has broken down. You put the context of Putin's war in the context of global events, including Trump's defeat in Iran. Then you say, given that these two things obtain, what proposal do we want to make for Russia's future? And here you need concreteness, which means you avoid two things. You avoid saying, well, this is what's wrong with the Putin regime. That was Mr. Prigozhin's problem, and he ended up dead. Right? He critiqued the regime but offered no alternative. If Prigozhin had offered an alternative, let's say it was a very tyrannical alternative, nothing to do with liberal democracy, he could have posed a greater existential threat to Putin. If he had said, these are my 5 rules for how the army will be run, these are my 7 principles for the shape of the FSB in 2030, right? He could have had more success, posed a greater danger to the regime that way. All he actually did was just make a critique at the level of competence of the regime. He said, whatever you guys try your hand at, you fail. You are losers. But then what's it like to win? Right? Now, you can't just critique Putin and his politics. You have to offer an alternative. What does the alternative look like? It has to be filled in. It can't be procedural. It can't be, well, the alternative is that we have free elections and Russians choose, because the depoliticized Russians are going to feel, we did that in the 90s and this is how we got to where we are. So what are you proposing? We just repeat the Yeltsin-Putin succession. We get a Yeltsin and we're going to get another Putin in 2050. So we're already here. Why repeat the thing? We've already got the thing. No point going through all the motions. You can't just say procedurally, let's do X, Y, Z and see what happens. You have to offer a proposal. The proposal has to be concrete. It can't be, we want the West. Right? There's a difference between Portuguese politics and Australian politics and Greek politics and Canadian politics and Argentinian politics and Japanese politics. What do you actually propose? Right? And it has to be not just concrete at the level of picking particular bits of what's happening in different countries and saying we like it. There has to be an account of how you're going to specifically apply that, right, to particular bits of Russia's political system or to particular bits of Russia's political culture. So you're going to have to get concrete. We are centrist and we're center right and we're center left and we're center up and center down and center through and center beyond and blah, blah, blah. No. No. That's running on the spot. That's running on the spot. What would life be like if things went well for the ordinary Russian citizen in 10 points? And how would it be different to today? And what steps are the steps that will best get you to this new scenario, right? Here I am open to being myself procedural because I'm speaking to a Western audience from a Western perspective. So I don't care what they fill this stuff out with, but they've got to fill this stuff out, right? It's an empty sort of direction toward a non-existent destination to say we want to be like the West. You're basically sending an envelope to an address that doesn't exist. So that's the problem. You've got to recognize the state of the world. You've got to recognize the state of domestic politics in the world today, how it's under pressure from various social forces. You've got to recognize the breakdown of the international order, and that will allow you to contextualize the way Russia is unique and not unique in its different presentations. It'll allow you to recognize that Russia is a vanguard in some ways of some of the things that are going wrong in the world. And one of the lessons here actually is that you can't make a proposal of Russia's future without making a proposal for the world. So funnily enough, while we might accuse these people of a kind of procedural arrogance, they need to be less arrogant, but also more arrogant. You can't propose anything for Russia's future unless part of that proposal is also a proposal that applies to bits of the rest of the world, because we're all under the impact of the pulls and pushes of different social forces. You can't propose anything for Russia unless it's also partly a proposal addressed to the different parts of the world. So you do that, and then you make concrete political proposals, right? What are you going to do with the military? What kind of shape will the military take? What kind of shape will the various security agencies take? Right, Prigozhin was actually in a good position to do that himself. He could have made a proposal about the security services, about the security state, about the state of the military, and so on. So make concrete proposals. Some of the concrete proposals could be procedural. You could talk about the way you need to decentralize and federalize Russia, for instance. Sure. All of that is good, right? But the problem is you completely omit everything I've just put on the table if you start and finish with just a procedural conversation about how some people gathered together in Berlin and had a cup of tea and a few quarrels, right? That is not going to generate in it by itself anything. What is the most generous thing we can say about the situation that these people are in? While being as generous as we possibly can be toward their proceduralism. What we can say is, look, what you've just said is ludicrous and unacceptable. Maybe we would have been more open and more enthused, just as observers of politics and observers of politics who can say, well, that's good politics, that's not very good politics. Would have been more enthused if you'd said, look, I am absolutely convinced that we need a clear and explicit proposal for a Russia of the future. But I'm going to give this in 1 year. Because first of all, we're going to get ourselves organized. We're going to get ourselves procedurally arranged. 1 year from now, I'm going to give a manifesto of what exactly I'm proposing for the future of Russia. So that could have been acceptable. And you could have said it like this. Look, we have been so bad at thinking of an alternative for Russia's future that we can't just announce it on the day of our first sort of gathering and the inauguration of our party. We need to take time with this because we have been completely pathological about this. This has been a block for us. None of us have been able to do this. And so we need to get our act together and try our hand at achieving something we've failed to do for years. And if you look at the generation at the Russian opposition, for decades. Give us a year, we'll be back, and we're gonna tell you where we need to go, and we're gonna tell you what the alternative is, and we're gonna tell you how it might be actionable, right? This stuff is quite terrifying. Like if I were, not a Western person, if I had stayed longer in the Soviet Union, I really deeply identified with my Russianness, I'd be absolutely terrified by this because it's a complete evasion of reality. It's a politics that evades politics and congratulates itself for doing politics while evading politics. What's left?